On the outskirts of Marshall County, Alabama, behind a line of pine trees and broken fencing, stood an institution locals once referred to in whispers as the Still House. Its real name was the Willowbrook Female Reformatory, founded in 1877 with money traced back to northern benefactors and southern clergy. It was meant to be a place of reform and redemption for wayward young girls, many of whom were forcibly removed from their families or off the streets after the Civil War. But something inside that place was wrong. The girls inside never seemed to change. Their faces remained untouched by time, their eyes vacant. By the time state inspectors came to shut it down in 1914, dozens of files were missing, and not one girl who had entered in its first decade could be located. Willowbrook Female Reformatory was officially recorded as a moral rehabilitation facility for indigent and delinquent white girls ages 9 to 15. Founded in the summer of 1877 by a coalition of religious leaders and ex-Confederate officers, it was hailed in the Montgomery Tribune as a Southern stronghold of female virtue and moral cleanliness. Designed to remove impurity and idleness from young girls left orphaned or destitute by the war, the institution adopted a strict regimen of religious instruction, labor, and isolation. Photographs from the era show a pristine white building with narrow windows and a bell tower, surrounded by trimmed hedges and tight gravel paths. Girls in identical dresses line up with clasped hands. The few visitors allowed past the front hall were offered guided tours of the chapel, dormitories, and sewing rooms. There was no schoolroom, no laughter, no scent of food. The girls looked still, thin and tired, but respectable. If any of them ever left, their names were never published. The institution's reputation. They said Willowbrook stood for the protection of fragile innocence, for the sanctity of young white womanhood in a changing world that terrified the men who funded it. What they feared most wasn't poverty or moral decay, but freedom. The postbellum South, still writhing under the terms of Reconstruction, found in institutions like Willowbrook a way to reclaim control under the pretense of guardianship. Girls as young as 8 were declared vagrants or moral deviants, with no evidence beyond their orphan status, their mixed bloodlines, or their presence in public spaces without a male escort. County judges, many of them former plantation owners, signed their names to the commitment papers with careless speed, especially when it came with a letter from Reverend Hillman, the institution's first and longest-serving director. Hillman had come from Tennessee, where he'd served as a chaplain for Confederate wounded. His sermons were filled with apocalyptic imagery and long, winding pleas for moral revival. He arrived in Marshall County with a proposal, a set of architectural blueprints, and a letter of blessing from the Alabama Synod. Within months, the land was cleared, contracts signed, and construction began. Willowbrook opened with room for 48 girls. By 1879, it held over 90. There were no official enrollment or release records published in county papers, only the yearly donor reports, which boasted glowing statistics about souls reformed and lives saved. From the outside, the building looked like a forgotten plantation house repurposed with stiff Victorian ambition. It had no playground, no music room, no trees taller than a child's reach. Instead, visitors were shown the laundry outbuilding, the modest chapel with its bare wooden cross, and a sparse library stocked mostly with moral literature and collections of psalms. There were no books written after 1859. Inside, the dormitories were filled with narrow iron beds, all bolted to the floors. Each girl was assigned a number and a single shift of clothing, which they washed themselves weekly. They were forbidden from speaking during meals and slept under constant supervision. Their days were tightly regimented. Dawn prayers, 2 hours of sewing, 1 hour of scripture study, assigned labor, silence, more prayer. Journalists from Montgomery and Birmingham were occasionally invited to tour the facility in its first decade, especially during holiday fundraising drives. Their articles always followed the same arc: praise for the cleanliness, admiration for the discipline, a passing observation about the odd silence of the girls. But one column from 1881 noted something strange. The girls, according to the writer, appear ageless and peculiarly alike in temperament, as though the regimen of the institution has rendered them uniformly subdued. The line was struck from reprints in later editions. Word of mouth in neighboring towns was different. Families who lost daughters to the county orphan lists rarely heard from them again. Sometimes a letter would arrive. Unsteady handwriting, overly formal tone, always signed with a number instead of a name. When families attempted to visit, they were told their child was in illness quarantine or spiritual retreat. Many gave up trying. A few returned with angry letters or threats to the Board of Trustees. None were answered, and in court the reformatory's legal immunity stood firm. The staff at Willowbrook was carefully curated. Only unmarried women over the age of 35 were considered for matron roles, and they were never allowed to leave the grounds except for religious purposes. Many of them lived in the attic quarters and were reportedly chosen for their resolute temperaments and resistance to maternal sentimentality. This was not a place for nurturers. It was a place for rules, for cleansing the body of disobedience and the mind of distraction. Annual reports from Reverend Hillman painted a portrait of divine success. The girls, he wrote, have grown pure in spirit, even if their frames remain youthful. That phrase appeared more than once. When questioned by a visiting clergyman in 1883 about the lack of graduation or release ceremonies, Hillman replied that moral progress does not correlate with worldly milestones. The girls, he said, were in God's time now. But strange details continued to leak. A traveling missionary who stayed 2 nights in the guest quarters wrote in her diary that she awoke to a chorus of soft chanting from the floor below. The sound stopped the moment she opened her door. A former cook who left the institution under ambiguous terms claimed the girls never menstruated and that their mealtimes were oddly sparse, more like communion than sustenance. One local boy who wandered onto the grounds in 1886 said he saw rows of girls in grey dresses, standing completely still in the sun, their eyes fixed on nothing. When asked what they looked like, he said, "Like dolls before they're painted." But the stories never reached any courtroom. No charges were brought and no state investigation was authorized. Instead, Willowbrook became a line item in the county budget and a quiet badge of honor for the churchmen who visited each spring. Every decade, the building received minor repairs. The bell tower was never used. No hymns were sung. And yet, every Easter, a new group of girls appeared in freshly ironed uniforms, staring silently from behind the chapel's stained glass window as the congregation posed for photographs outside. When Reverend Hillman died in 1898, his funeral was attended by over 200 men. A marble plaque was installed in the chapel wall, engraved with a verse from Ecclesiastes and a phrase that would appear again in the final records before the institution's closure: "There is no new thing under the sun." Ignored signs. In the summer of 1901, Dr. Louise Ann Kettridge, a young medical graduate from Baltimore, was invited to conduct a short-term health survey of institutional diets across Alabama. It was meant to be a 3-week assignment, the kind given to recent graduates with connections but little experience. She arrived at Willowbrook on July 3rd with a valise full of medical instruments and a carefully typed letter of introduction from the State Health Board. She was met at the gate by a tall, stone-faced woman named Matron Aldwych, who let her inside without greeting. The door was bolted behind them. Kettridge would later describe in her personal notes that the atmosphere inside Willowbrook was unlike any other institution she had visited. It wasn't the silence, though that was notable, nor the symmetry of the rooms or the stiffness of the girls' postures. It was the absence of age. She interviewed 20 girls her first morning. Not one had visible signs of adolescence: no acne, no breast development, no menstruation. They answered her questions in stilted, identical phrases. When asked about their last illness, each one said the same thing: "I have not been ill, I am in reform." She pressed further. Several girls recited phrases that sounded memorized, including "We are not of the flesh anymore" and "God's time is inside." Kettridge was unsettled. That night she wrote to her supervisor requesting a second evaluator be sent. The letter was never received. Over the next 10 days, Kettridge recorded 24 interviews and attempted physical examinations on 12 girls. Each was denied beyond pulse and temperature by Matron Aldwych, who claimed modesty protocols prohibited exposure of undergarments or skin. When Kettridge insisted, she was told her credentials were no longer valid for a spiritual hospital. She was escorted to her room and warned not to interfere with divine routine. 2 days later, she attempted to leave. The main gates were chained. The carriage service she'd used to arrive had no record of her trip. The local depot never received her telegrams. For 5 days, she was kept inside the reformatory, under watch, allowed only to eat and sleep. Her journal ends abruptly on July 17th. But in 1904, her sister received a package with no return address. Inside was a Bible with underlined verses, and tucked inside the back cover were 3 pressed violets and a single page of medical notes. The page listed names and numbers, all of them girls between the ages of 9 and 14. None of them aged past that range, according to the entry dates. The document had a red fingerprint in the corner. It was never matched. By 1906, a local teacher named James Delaney began quietly collecting stories from families whose daughters had vanished into Willowbrook. He was particularly interested in the case of a girl named Mary Evelyn Hasker, age 10, who had been sent to the reformatory after her mother was jailed for vagrancy. Her aunt received a letter from the institution 5 years later, written in Mary's name, thanking her for continued prayers and gifts. The strange part was this. The girl referred to the color of her favorite dress, a red calico frock, which she had worn on her first day at the institution. But the dress had been taken from her before arrival. She never saw it again. Delaney found 3 other letters, all in different handwriting, that repeated the same phrase, "I am well and I am still." None of the girls were ever seen again. Delaney tried to raise the issue with the Marshall County Orphan Committee, but the board was chaired by Reverend Beale, a cousin of the late Hillman, who dismissed the complaints as emotional fiction. When Delaney pushed further, his school contract was not renewed. He left the state the following year. His research notes were later found in the library archives of a now-defunct normal school. Among the papers was a photograph from 1887, labeled Willowbrook Annual Easter. In it, a row of girls in grey smocks stand motionless in front of the chapel. Delaney circled one of the faces in pencil, with the note, "Same face, 1892, 1895, 1901. The girl's expression never changed. By the turn of the century, the institution's public presence had shrunk. No more donor visits, no more holiday articles. A short column in the Decatur Evening Bulletin in 1909 described Willowbrook as a fading light of moral tradition still keeping its watch. But inside, things remained the same. Girls arrived, girls stayed, girls stopped changing. A rare visitor in 1910, a traveling piano tuner named Ernest Haller, reported that he was brought in to examine the chapel organ. He later told his wife that he saw 50 girls in one room, all seated, all silent, and not one looked older than 12. He said their skin looked stiff, like they were waxed over. He tried to ask one of them her age. She didn't answer. A matron stepped between them and said, "She has been given peace. Please do not disturb her with the world's questions." That same year, a fire was reported in the southern wing of the dormitory. The blaze was small, quickly contained, and no injuries were noted. But photographs from local firemen show blackened windows and melted door frames. A report filed quietly by a junior inspector noted that some of the dormitory beds showed no signs of having been used in years. When asked why they remained made and unused, Reverend Beale wrote, "Spiritual preparation often includes waiting." The State Health Board attempted a casual inspection in 1912 after mounting concerns over the lack of medical filings. 2 junior clerks were dispatched. They returned 3 days later, shaken and unwilling to testify. Their report was a single paragraph. Willowbrook is not a hospital in any modern sense. No medical procedures are in place. No growth is allowed. By 1913, only whispers remained. The funding was drying up. The church had shifted its resources elsewhere. And yet, when a formal request to close the institution was brought before the State Council, it was met with an anonymous donation of $5,000 and a letter stating, "The work must until it is complete." no signature, just a line from Ecclesiastes. It would take the death of a matron, a runaway girl, and a missing ledger to finally bring the doors of Willowbrook shut. But even then, the truth would never be written in official records. Roe uncovered. On February 12, 1914, matron Edith Lambay was found dead in the chapel hallway. Her body collapsed beneath the pulpit stairs, her face turned skyward. There were no visible wounds. The attending physician, summoned from Guntersville, marked the cause of death as cardiac failure, a term often used when no real answer was acceptable. But there was one detail he noted in private, shared with a cousin in the sheriff's office. Lambay's fingernails were torn down to the quick, her palms scraped raw, as if she had clawed at something unseen just before collapsing. Her death prompted a temporary closure of the chapel and a suspension of routine for 2 days. During this brief disruption, a girl identified only as number 46 escaped through an unlocked window in the laundry room. She was found 5 days later by a farmer in Etowah County, barefoot and curled in a hay shed, unable to speak. She was estimated to be around 10 years old. Her hair was cropped unevenly, her nails chewed to the base, and her eyes showed signs of intense photophobia, sensitivity to light common in individuals who have lived in extreme isolation. She was brought to the county infirmary, where after several days a nurse managed to extract a name, Anna Lorne. County records showed an Anna Lorne had been admitted to Willowbrook in 1888, aged 9. If this was the same girl, she should have been 35. She appeared no older than 11. Medical professionals refused to believe it. Photographs were compared, but the only existing image from 1890 was grainy and inconclusive. Nevertheless, a quiet panic began to circulate. The press, long denied entry to the facility, began pressing for interviews. The infirmary refused to release the girl. 2 weeks later, she vanished from her room. The nurse on duty claimed she turned her back for just a moment. The window was still locked from the inside. With pressure mounting and whispers of unnatural conditions inside Willowbrook reaching the State House, a legislative commission was formed. But before any formal inspection could take place, Reverend Beale announced the institution would be permanently dissolved in accordance with divine instruction. The building was shuttered on May 3, 1914. When state officials arrived, they found the dormitories empty, the chapel desecrated by mildew and water stains, and the record room gutted. Files had been burned in the stove, leaving behind only fragments, half-names, ink-smudged dates, pages of copied scripture. A single ledger survived, hidden behind a false panel in the organ loft. It contained handwritten notations of every girl assigned a number between 1877 and 1901. After 1901, the pages were blank, save for repeated scrawls of the same verse. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. The inspectors found the building structurally sound but suffocating. Doors were locked from the outside. Beds still bore the faint outlines of small bodies. Several mattresses had thin straps sewn into their corners. In a hidden basement room, not on the blueprints, they discovered rows of shallow drawers built into the walls, each lined with what appeared to be salt. A faint floral odor lingered, like preserved lavender or dried violets. One inspector vomited, another refused to enter. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was in the attic, where the matrons had lived. There under the eaves was a hand-drawn map of the institution sketched in charcoal. Circles marked rooms labeled still, waking, and diminishment. None of these names corresponded to any known floor plan. Beside it, pinned with a sewing needle to the wood, was a list of names. Most were crossed out. A few had red stars beside them. At the bottom, in a different hand, were the words, "They remain." The state issued no formal report. Local newspapers published a bland summary. Willowbrook closed due to declining enrollment. No mention was made of the girl who didn't age, of the bodies that weren't there, of the locked windows and silent beds. Within months, the land was sold to a private buyer. The building was left to rot, but not everyone forgot. In 1922, a pair of university researchers from Birmingham attempted to track down surviving family members of the original enrollees. They found only 2 who would speak on record. One, a woman whose aunt had been committed in 1885, described a recurring dream she'd had since childhood. A line of girls standing in ankle-deep water, eyes fixed on the horizon, hands joined loosely at their sides. Another man, whose sister had vanished in 1893, claimed to have seen her face in a crowd on a streetcar in St. Louis in 1919. She didn't look a day over 10, he said, but her eyes looked ancient. For decades, the site remained untouched. Hunters avoided it. Children dared each other to approach but never crossed the threshold. The bell tower collapsed during a storm in 1937. In 1951, a fire took what remained of the roof. No formal effort was ever made to restore or investigate, but scattered records, whispers, and unsolved mysteries persisted. In 1973, an amateur historian named Marie Delaney, the great-granddaughter of James Delaney, published a private newsletter detailing what she called the still house phenomenon. In it, she reprinted fragments from journals, photographs, and a transcript of an interview with a former groundskeeper who worked at the site from 1908 to 1914. He claimed he had to mow the same patch of lawn every week, even though the grass never grew. He said the girls never spoke to him, never moved unless instructed, but always watched. Always. Marie's work was dismissed as fringe material, a curiosity, a southern oddity. But some of her readers began to submit letters. One woman from Mobile claimed her grandmother told her stories of a place where time fell asleep. Another from Georgia sent a photograph taken in 1896 showing a group of girls in identical smocks, one of whom matched the photo Delaney had circled years earlier. Same posture, same eyes, same ribbon in the hair. In 1984, the final piece of confirmed evidence emerged during renovations of a courthouse in Marshall County. Workers uncovered an old wooden box, sealed behind a section of plaster. Inside were 4 girls' dresses, carefully folded, and a notebook with a leather strap. The pages were mostly ruined by water, but a few lines could still be read. They do not sleep. They do not hunger. They wait. The reform was never of the body. There are no birthdays, there is only stillness. Chapter 3 ends here. Type PAN or Chapter 4 when you're ready to proceed. Legacy and silence. When the last remains of Willowbrook were bulldozed in 1991 to make way for a suburban development project called Shady Pines Estates, only a single journalist was present. Her name was Karen Albright, a freelance writer for a regional Alabama historical magazine. She had read Marie Delaney's newsletter in college and had quietly followed the story ever since. She managed to slip past the construction site early one morning and took several photos of the collapsing foundation, the fragments of brick, the exposed wood beams blackened with age and smoke. She also claimed she saw something no one else reported, a small iron bed frame, half buried in red clay, with what appeared to be 2 child-sized handprints pressed into the dirt at its foot. The story she submitted was rejected by the magazine. The editor said it drifted into folklore. The photos were returned to her with a note, too grainy to use. She kept them in a locked drawer for years, until her sudden disappearance in 1998. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Her notes on Willowbrook were gone. The land where the institution once stood is now occupied by rows of nearly identical homes. Quiet, pastel-colored siding, short driveways, trimmed hedges. Children play on manicured lawns. There is no historical marker, no mention of what stood there before. But the families speak of certain things, sprinklers that activate without timers. Patches of grass that never need mowing, a narrow, almost undetectable depression that runs in a line behind where the chapel once stood. And then there's the children. A resident named Miriam Cole, who moved into Lot 18 in 1994, reported her daughter began sleepwalking, always toward the same corner of the backyard, always at 2:11 a.m. When asked what she saw in her dreams, the girl said, "They're not done yet." A neighbor, whose twins both developed severe photophobia, had windows in their home professionally tinted. They cried whenever church bells rang. But there were no churches nearby. In 2002, a high school history teacher named Roger Miles attempted to reconstruct the institution's full list of residents using property records and tax documents. He hit dead ends at every turn. Pages missing. Ledgers rewritten. Families who swore they never had female relatives. A library archivist told him, "It's like someone went through every drawer and decided what history was allowed to keep." Miles persisted until a break-in at his home led to the theft of only one thing, a binder labeled Willowbrook Crosscheck. He never spoke publicly about the case again, but the legacy of the reformatory continued in subtler forms. There were reports of old photographs found in attics across the state, always without names, always with the same faces. A girl with a side braid and a fixed expression, a group of 10 or 12, all identical in dress, always unsmiling. Sometimes the photos bore stamps from other institutions, homes for the blind, tuberculosis wards, even county fairs. But the girls never looked older, never younger. Always paused in that same eerie stillness. A copy of one such photo was submitted anonymously to the Alabama State Historical Society in 2011. It was postmarked from Pennsylvania. On the back, someone had written in faded pencil, "She asked me not to forget her number." 46. In 2015, a university podcast about Southern folklore aired a short episode on The Girls Who Never Aged. They interviewed local historians, pulled fragments from Marie Delaney's newsletters, and even tracked down descendants of those tangentially connected to Willowbrook. The episode was removed within a week due to legal concerns, and the audio was scrubbed. No transcripts remain online. Now all that's left are fragments, scattered photographs, rumors passed in quiet voices. A series of stone foundations beneath certain homes that no blueprint accounts for. A line in a crumbling Bible. A child's drawing found behind the drywall of a nursery during renovations in 2019. 12 girls in a row, all with empty circles for faces, standing beneath a sun labeled God's Eye. Attempts to retrieve any remaining state documents related to Willowbrook are met with form letters citing incomplete archives. Appeals are ignored. There is no graveyard, no alumni registry, no confirmed burial of Reverend Hillman, and no verified date of death for the girls first committed between 1877 and 1885. They simply stopped existing in records, as if they had slipped beyond the paper boundary of time itself. But people remember. In half-finished thoughts, in photographs they can't explain, in dreams that visit their daughters and never quite leave. What happened at Willowbrook was never supernatural. It was systemic, bureaucratic, carefully sustained by laws designed to hide what the world didn't want to see. Girls taken from poverty, from shame, from someone's bad reputation, placed into a building where nothing was allowed to grow, not their bodies, not their stories, not their futures. And when it ended the way these things always do. With silence. With forgetfulness. With new siding and grass, no one questions. If you ever find an old photo with too many identical faces, look closer. If they seem too still, if the smiles never reach the eyes, if the paper smells faintly of lavender, ask yourself what number they were given, and then ask why you were never meant to know it. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.